everyone, this is your guide to give a bit of an overview of romantic notions in art and literature, which is actually one of my specialties. So I think you will see some very interesting material here. Given that this is a survey of world lit, we are going to jump around a little bit. We obviously went from sort of classical Greek literature and a little bit about Native American myths to jumping right into the late 18th to mid 19th century. The Romantic period was one of a lot of promise, and there are a series of sort of hallmarks, things that the Romantics greatly believed in. And I'm going to discuss some of those that you will actually see through your reading and through some of the examination of the pieces that we will be looking at really between now and the end of the semester. So this particular guide is a really important one that you definitely want to be probably taking notes on and remembering. And as always, it'll be available for you to reference whenever you would like to. One of probably the most important things that Romantics believed was the importance of the individual, individualism, that the self is important, right? That celebrating the accomplishments of the human spirit, that was something that the Romantics really greatly emphasized. And I think a really important point, and we're going to come back to this in a little bit, is that a person's sensory perceptions are valid no matter who they are. Whether they are the poor on the streets to the richest of men, everyone's perceptions of how they feel, how their emotions are relayed, how they can see something. Romantics really value that the individual could do things. The portrait you see in front of you is oftentimes used as a almost definitive expression of the Romantics' idea of the individual. Here we have pictured a gentleman. We can't see the front of his face, and that's because he's kind of looking out over nature, looking out over these mountains, these moors, and he's obviously taking in and having a certain perception the way he is seeing things. So the individual as important, huge element for the Romantics. With that in mind, the Romantics also believed that art and writing is really for everyone. And when I say art, I mean not only visual art like paintings, but also written art, novels, poetry, stories. Art is really for everyone. Art and literature should not be limited to those that are highly educated. Common man should be able to understand and appreciate art. Someone on the street should be able to pick up a poem and appreciate it. And with that said, the Romantics really believed in using simple language. Now, it may not be simple to us with our 21st century sort of sensibilities and how obviously the English language has morphed since the Romantic era, but for the time, the language was particularly simple. The picture that you see on this particular slide is of Wordsworth, who is probably one of the most influential poets and writers of the Romantic era. And Wordsworth actually really inspired the whole idea of simplicity, the idea that his writing could be easily accessible to anyone. The common subject, kind of going on the same idea that art is for everyone and that the individual is important. Before Romanticism, when you had a story or you had a novel or a poem or a play, and you had someone who was of the lower class, someone who was poor, they were really held in little to no esteem. They were almost portrayed as a comic relief or pathetic. If you think about Shakespeare even, when you think about sort of the lower classes that are portrayed in Shakespeare, the clown, the nurses, they're kind of portrayed as comic relief. They're not taken seriously. Romantics really believed that all subjects, no matter if it was a poor beggar on the street, all the way up to some sort of hero in the army, they should all be taken as important and as serious. The picture that you see here on this slide is actually something called, actually of a dilapidated abbey that Wordsworth actually wrote an entire poem about. There were a bunch of homeless beggars who were at this particular location, and Wordsworth actually takes the time to write about them. You get poems written by various poets about blacksmiths, about people who are sort of the common laborers. You didn't see that before Romanticism, and if you did see it, usually those types of people were taken in jest. Another really huge romantic milestone, a romantic notion, is that nature is important, and that nature and landscape ultimately can save people. Nature acts as a refuge and savior for mankind compared to newly industrialized cities and urban environments. This is really where you start to see the effects of urban living taking a toll on people. And the Romantics believe the best way to sort of regain one's soul would be to go to nature, to leave that urban environment. Landscape and nature brings joy and creativity. You get to see a heck of a lot of nature metaphors used in writing. And we actually will be taking a look at both those metaphors, and a little bit of later in the semester, we'll be taking a look at late Romanticism in America. And very clearly demonstrated through a text we're going to be reading, you'll see what happens when someone removes themselves from nature. According to the Romantics, the soul, the body began to deteriorate. So nature is particularly important. However, something to kind of bear in mind as you go through and look at some of this romantic literature, there starts to be some attack on these romantic notions, particularly mid-19th century. In 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species. So for anyone who knows The Origin of Species and knows what it is about, it really is a direct attack on some of these romantic ideals. The question I kind of posed here, why would Darwin's argument challenge romantic ideals about the power of the individual? Something to think about. The Origin of Species, if we had to summarize in its most concise form, one of the main arguments in Darwin's theory is survival of the fittest. So what Darwin essentially says that kind of takes these romantic notions and puts them on high alert is that really the individual isn't important. It really is a battle of who is sharper, who has the ability to rise to the top. This definitely affects romantics in a very direct way. And like I said, a little bit later this semester, you'll be reading a piece of late American Romanticism that pretty directly criticizes a bit of Darwin. So this is definitely one attack on those romantic notions historically that we'll come back to in a couple weeks. The first romantic piece that we're going to be reading is actually an essay. It is nonfiction, and it is written by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. It's a very interesting piece that we will be talking about at great length, but let's talk a little bit about Mary first. Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the first female philosophers and writers to really fit into what I would call like the good boys club so far as philosophy is concerned. Male writers and philosophers actually kind of treated her as an equal. She was considered painfully smart, really interesting, and really kind of held people to task to listen to what she had to say. She writes this piece, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792. And you'll see as you read it, it addresses female rights, not necessarily as a feminist issue, the way we think of feminism today, but rather as a humanity issue. Mary Wollstonecraft actually has a very interesting sort of life story. She highly criticized the notion of love, and you'll see that in the part of the Vindication that you're going to be reading. But she felt madly in love several times, and the gentleman who she eventually married, she became pregnant. And Mary Wollstonecraft actually died in childbirth. Mary Wollstonecraft's child, who survived, was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And many people believe, and it's very well documented, that Mary Shelley, for years, when she finally found out that she, in essence, killed her mother through the childbirth process, really couldn't get over that. And in many ways, many literary critics see the whole concept of Frankenstein, the whole idea of creation, the whole idea of creating a monster, very parallel to the way Mary Shelley saw herself, as sort of the destruction of this great woman. It's very, very interesting stuff, and I think you guys will enjoy reading A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and we'll be having some discussions about whether or not Mary Wollstonecraft's arguments about femininity, about women and men being good humans first and having good virtue, these sort of things are still relevant to today.